Hello everybody. Today's class is going to be on the Book of Ruth. Just a quick introduction since this is my first actual class. My name's Rachel Lester. Some of you probably know me from being here during classes and some of the services. Excuse me if I'm stammering a little bit, a little nervous since this is my first live class and I have not done live classes in many years. So let's get started. Let's just start with some quick facts on the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth, it is the fifth book in the Ketuvim section of the Tanakh. I think in Christian Old Testaments, which I don't know if anybody's using them, but I think that's in the historical section, but it's in the Ketuvim section of the Tanakh. According to the Talmud, the rabbis write that it was actually Samuel who wrote the Book of Ruth, and Ruth herself is considered a righteous convert. It's still a tradition for many female converts to actually choose the name of Ruth as their Hebrew name after their conversion. The Book of Ruth is also one of the Megillot, which is certain scrolls that are read throughout the year during certain times. Now, as probably most of you or all of you know, Shavuot's coming up this weekend, and it's a tradition to read the Book of Ruth during Shavuot. It's a way of honoring King David, who is Ruth's grandson. And the Book of Ruth generally can be divided into 4 different parts. There's 4 chapters. It's traditionally divided into 4 different parts. Chapter 1 is the prologue and the problem. So that's the kind of the backstory of everything. Chapter 2 is where Ruth meets Boaz. Chapter 3 is when Naomi sends Ruth to Boaz. And then chapter 4 is the resolution and the epilogue. End of story. It's a short book, but it's really packed full of a lot of information. So any questions or anything so far? And please let me know if I talk a little too fast. I'm from the Midwest and I talk really fast at times. So just let me know if I'm going too fast, okay? Okay. So chapter 1. This is the prologue and the problem. Now, Elimelech, who's Naomi's husband, he took his family from Judah. Okay, they lived in Bethlehem. And he took his wife Naomi and his 2 sons, and they went to Moab. Now, the question is, why did he leave Judah and go to Moab? Does anybody have any ideas? This might actually be in your Tanakhs if you have them open in the commentary as to why he took his family to Moab away from the land of Israel, from Judah. Any ideas? If you look at Rashi, which is a commentator that we pretty much all come to know and love or despise, depending on your situation, he says that Elimelech ran away because he and his family were pretty well off, but there was a famine in Judah at the time. He decided to go to Moab, and the reason Rashi says he went is because he didn't want to feed the poor. He was being stingy. Whether that's true or not, it's not. Yeah, he was an importer-exporter, which would make him pretty wealthy. I mean, because Israel is right on the trade routes between Asia and Africa. various parts of the Middle East, even into Europe at that point. Rashi says that he was essentially stingy, and he took his family to Moab because he didn't want to feed the poor. Now he has two sons with him. There's Elimelech, there was Naomi, and there's their two sons, Machlon and Kilion. Machlon and Kilion married two Moabite women by the name of Orpah and Ruth. Now they were there for, it says in the text, 10 years. We don't know if it's exactly 10 years, but they were there to the point that it was pretty much an understanding that they weren't going to go back to Judah. Now, unfortunately for Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, Elimelech and the two sons died. Rashi also explains that their premature deaths were because they ran from Judah, meaning that they rejected the Holy Land, and because they could feed the poor, but they chose not to feed the poor, they thereby broke the mitzvah of taking care of the poor. So that's why Rashi explains how or why the three of them died premature deaths. Now, upon the deaths of Elimelech and his two sons, Naomi decided to go back to Judah. There was nothing keeping her there in Moab, and there's some indication that at this point the famine was starting to lift in Judah, so she decided to go back. Her daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah, initially started to go with her. Naomi tried to get them to go back. She was, saying that, please go back to your family. She even says, go back to your gods. Which sounds kind of strange, but that's what she said. And she said, I'm old. I have no other sons for you to marry. Don't come with me. This is going to be a hard life if you come with me. The two women initially said, well, we're still going to go with you. But then after some more pleading and explaining the hardships, Orpah finally said, okay, this isn't for me. I'm not going to go to Judah with you. She leaves. Now, does anyone know, this is just a little tidbit that I learned. I'm one of those people that learns a lot of useless information. And there is a tradition as to someone, I don't want to say important, but famous, that is Orpah's descendant. Does anybody have any clue who that was? This is something that those rabbis came up with. It's written in the Talmud. Does anybody have any idea who her descendant was? I can give you a clue that it's someone who had a run-in with David when he was young. Think slingshot and pebbles from the brook. While David was Naomi's descendant, who was Orpah's descendant? David had a run-in with Orpah's descendant. Now this is just, it's tradition, it's something the rabbis taught, it's not something in the text at all. Alright, Paul, you got it. Goliath. Yes. They have said that it's in Sota 42b that Goliath is actually the descendant of Orpah. I just thought that was a pretty interesting little factoid. I'll call it a fact. So, Naomi and Ruth kept going towards Judah. Orpah left. She went back to her family. back to her gods, back to her father's home. Now, Ruth declared, however, to Naomi that even with all the hardships, she was determined to stay with Naomi. She knew Naomi was not going to have any other sons for her to marry. She knew that going to a foreign land, being a foreigner in a foreign land, was going to be very difficult. But she said that she was going to go back with her. In Ruth chapter 1 verses 16 and 17, it says, "But Ruth answered, 'Do not urge me to abandon you, to turn back from following you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people are my people, and your God is my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May God do this to me and more, if anything but death separates me from you.'" So she was very insistent, and Naomi allowed her to go back with her. Now, just as an aside, according to Karaite Judaism, according to their teachings, it was at this point that Ruth made a vow before Hashem. And if you're at all familiar with the Torah, you know that making vows to Hashem, it's very important. It's something you don't take lightly. Okay? And it was at this point that, according to Karaite Judaism, that Ruth converted. She became a Jew. She became part of the Israelite community. Rabbinic Judaism teaches that she made this somewhat of a vow, but then went before the Beit Din and went through a formal conversion process. But according to Karaite Judaism, this is where she converted, and as of today, this is how people who convert to the Karaite sect of Judaism, that they make this same vow, and that is their conversion process. So that's just a little aside. So, any questions so far? Just let me know if I'm going too fast. Okay, so let's see. Naomi permitted Ruth to accompany her back to Judah, back to Bethlehem. And at this point, because they were both widows, they were poor, they were allowed to go out into the fields to the gleanings, pick up the gleanings, and that's what they subsisted on. That was their food. Now, the question comes, though, that if you remember what I said, Elimelech took his family to Moab. Ruth is a Moabitess. Okay? Now, if you look at Deuteronomy 23 verses 4 through 5, this actually kind of causes a problem because she's a Moabitess. It reads, "An Ammonite or Moabite may not enter God's marriage group. They may never enter God's marriage group even after the 10th generation. This is because they did not greet you with bread and water when you were on the way out of Egypt, and also because they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor in Aram Naharim to curse you." Now, that leads to the question, okay, so if Ruth converted, has become a member of the Israelites, and is now eligible to marry into the Israelite family, how can a Moabite convert? And that's been a big problem for a lot of people. They really question that, especially since David is her descendant, and since David is her descendant, eventually the Mashiach will also be her descendant. Now, according to Rabbinical Judaism, does anybody know how Rabbinical Judaism answers the question of how a female Moabite, can actually join the Israelite people if it says in Deuteronomy, even to the 10th generation they cannot join? Does anybody know the rabbinical, what the sages teach about this? No ideas? Rabbinical Judaism states that this passage in Deuteronomy only applies to the males, which in some way makes sense. And even in the one that I'm using R.A. Kaplan's Living Torah translation. It even has in there male, in brackets to show it's not part of the actual Hebrew, but that's what they have in there. In a way that makes sense, because back then, if an Israelite female would marry a male Moabite or anybody outside, Moabite, Canaanite, whatever, more than likely she is going to leave with him. She's going to go to his family and essentially be lost to the Israelites. So in a way that makes sense as an explanation. Now, there are other sects, like the Karaites, that point out that the Moabites and those of other nations, such as the Ammonites that are in Deuteronomy, that are mentioned in Deuteronomy, and all the others, that we're told they are not allowed to marry in, they're not allowed to become Israelites, that really the only ones they're talking about are the ones who reject Torah, reject Hashem. They're not allowed to marry in. Now, if they accept Torah, accept Hashem as their God, they're allowed in. Okay, which is exactly what Ruth did. She accepted Torah, she accepted Hashem as her one God, and she was invited in. This is actually supported throughout the Tanakh. In Joshua, you have Rahab. You have in First Chronicles, you have Itmah the Moabite, so another Moabite. You have Zelek the Ammonite in 2 Samuel, and then you have the most famous one, who is Uriah the Hittite in 2 Samuel. And if you read through these, it looks like all of these people were converts, even though it says in Deuteronomy, even to the 10th generation, they cannot be in the Israelite people. So it's kind of one of those things where you're reading along and you're like, wait, Ruth the Moabite, how can she now be an Israelite? But that's just a couple of the explanations. You can take it or leave it, however, whatever your belief is. So that's the end of chapter 1. Any questions or anything? Okay. Let's go on to chapter 2. And this is where Ruth and Boaz meet for the first time. Now, just as a side note, Boaz, according to Rashi and some different sages and rabbis, they teach that Boaz is actually Ibzan from Bethlehem, who is actually a judge. And you can see this in Judges chapter 12. Let's see, verses 8 through 10. They talk about Ibzan. It reads, "After him, Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel. He had 30 sons, and he married off 30 daughters, and brought in 30 girls for his sons from the outside. He judged Israel 7 years. Ibzan died and was buried in Bethlehem." That's just one of those things that the rabbis teach. I'm not exactly sure how they combine the two. There are some indications that Boaz was at least some kind of a judge, even like a I should say a lower court judge within the community. But that's just one of those things that the rabbis are saying, well, Boaz is actually this other person. They're one and the same. Let's see. Now, when they got back to Judah, like I said, they're both widows, they're poor, they go out and get gleanings. That's how they live, so they can have their daily bread, they can have their food. And Ruth insisted she would go out, she would glean for herself and for Naomi, to make sure that they had enough to live on, that they could survive. And the gleaning comes actually from verses in Leviticus where we are told that the farmers are to allow unripened grapes to remain on the vines. They're not to glean everything off their fields. They're to leave the corners or the edges, it depends on how you translate it, of the field open, so the stranger, the poor, the widow can go out and they can get this food to survive. So that's what Ruth does for herself and for Naomi. And it so happens that she goes to Boaz's field, and that's where she gleans. So Boaz arrives at the field, greets his workers, greets his supervisor, and is like, who is this woman? I don't know her, I'm not familiar with her. And the supervisor tells him, this is Ruth the Moabite. She came back to Judah with Naomi. Now, Boaz is related to Naomi, so he obviously knows who Naomi is, and I would assume know that her husband or sons have died. So Boaz goes over to Ruth, who is sitting in a sukkah. She's in a little hut from being out in the heat of the day trying to cool off. So he goes over, he introduces himself to her, and he tells her to stay in his field because she will be safe there. If she needs any water, just go get the water. She's free to go about as she needs. And he made sure that the supervisor, the overseer, the head, the guy head of his farmhands, he tells him, make sure she's not harassed. Leave her alone. Let her gather what she wants. Don't harass her. He even goes so far as to being so hospitable that he invites Ruth to dine with him and his hired hands that night. And she's allowed to eat her fill, eat as much as food as she wants. Which is pretty incredible if you think about it, because he just met her. And he's saying, don't harass her, let her do what she wants, let her gather as much as she wants, and hey, come have a meal with us and eat to your heart's desire. He also told his men out in the fields to leave a little extra behind for her so she can gather it and take it home to Naomi. So he's also giving her extras on top of, just allowing her to gather as much as she wants in his fields. And from what I gather from the text is that Boaz is a pretty wealthy man. It seems like he has a lot of fields, a lot of wheat and barley out there. So he's I read in one of the commentaries, I think it was Rashi, but I'm not sure, it might have been Ibn Ezra, Boaz he's very kind and very gentle. He's also very learned in the Torah, and that just puts him at a higher level. Let's see. So Ruth goes back to Naomi, has lots and lots of barley that she brings back for food, and she tells, Naomi's like, oh, where have you gone to glean? Whose field have you been in? and she tells her everything that happened, that it's Boaz's field. At this point, Naomi is ecstatic. She praises Hashem because she knows that Boaz is a good man, that it was Hashem who made it possible for Ruth to find her way to Boaz's field. That this was something that was meant to happen, essentially. So that's the end of chapter 2. Any questions? Any comments? Okay, let's go on to chapter 3. And this is where Naomi sends Ruth over to meet Boaz. Well, a little more informally, I should say, to meet Boaz. We're getting towards the end of the harvest at this point, and Boaz decides to spend the night in the field at the threshing floor because apparently at this point you have to worry about thieves coming in during the night and taking your property. So he's there, he's sleeping, and Naomi thinks it's time for Ruth to search for a husband. She's been in Judah long enough and she's young enough that she needs to find a husband to take care of her, to have children with her. And she instructs Ruth to go to the threshing floor that night and to uncover Boaz's feet. Now this sounds a little odd, but by uncovering his feet, she uncovers his sandals. Okay? Now there's a reason for this, and does anyone have an idea as to why this odd thing about uncovering his sandals? I mean, what is that all about, do you think? Think about Torah. Think about if a wife, you're on the right track, Paul, available for marriage. It's a specific kind of marriage, though. The widow of someone who didn't have children, but there's another brother available. What do they call that kind of marriage where the brother is supposed to marry the widow of his brother? Yeah. Does anybody know what the term usually is for that? What they usually call that? And I'm not actually sure where they even get this term, but has anybody heard of levirate marriage? It's something that is from the Torah. You can see that in Deuteronomy chapter 25. Let's see, verses 5 through 9. When brothers live together, and one of them dies childless, the dead man's wife shall not be allowed to marry an outsider. Her husband's brother must cohabitate with her, making her his wife, and thus performing a brother-in-law's duty to her. The firstborn son whom she bears will then perpetuate the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be obliterated from Israel. So that's essentially what that was. But you still have the thing about the shoes. Well, we'll get to them. Now, Boaz is obviously going to be startled awake. He's fast asleep. He's probably been working all day. And now all of a sudden his feet are uncovered. Well, that would be a little startling in the middle of the night. Especially if you're already worried about thieves and such. So, he wakes up and he's like, what are you doing here? Why are you doing this? Ruth explains. Naomi told her to explain. No, I was the daughter-in-law of Elimelech. I married one of his sons. He's deceased. Now I'm looking for a husband, and you are a close relative. Which means that you are the first one I'm going to within the line of this family, saying, okay, this is your duty. This is your duty to marry me. So Boaz tells her, he understands, he's not mad at her, but there is someone else who is a closer relative that has to be offered her hand in marriage first. And he sends her away with lots and lots of barley, and he sends her away early because he doesn't want her reputation tarnished. Because obviously she's there in the middle of the night with Boaz and presumably with a bunch of other men. He doesn't want her to be tarnished. People start talking about her. So he sends her away with, I think it's like 6, I don't know, it's a lot of barley. And that's the end of chapter 3. So on to chapter 4. This is nearing the end of the book. Ruth went home, told Naomi what was going on. Naomi said, okay, stay here for the day, because she knows that Boaz is not going to let the day end before everything is settled. Before they know if Boaz is going to marry Ruth or if this other relative is going to marry her. So Boaz goes to the gate of the city. And I think this is in part where the sages think, well, he must be this judge that they talk about in the book of Judges. Because it almost sounds like, well, if he's going to the gate and he assembles a minyan, a quorum of 10 men, that it sounds like he's going to be sitting in, I don't know if you really say judgment, but there's some kind of a lower court judge kind of quality to it. And so he calls together this minyan to be witnesses. And we see in the very first verse of Ruth chapter 4 says, Boaz meanwhile had gone up to the gate and sat down there. Just then the Redeemer whom Boaz had mentioned passed by. Boaz said, come over and sit down here, Ploni Almoni. So he came over and sat down. Okay, Ploni Almoni. That's the name that is, I should say name loosely, given to this other relative, this closer redeemer. That quote-unquote name is actually equivalent to the English John Doe. They're not giving this closer relative redeemer's name, actually. Now, we know from Zechariah and 2 Samuel that this redeemer's name, this closer relative's name, is actually Tov, which means good. But in Ruth, he's not actually named. There's a couple explanations for this. One of them is that this name of John Doe, it can also refer to someone who's timid, real retiring, kind of internal and shy. They're not willing to come out of their shell. Even though they're good, they may be a good person. Like, his name is Tov. I mean, it means good. He's a good person, but he's not willing to step outside himself. Even when it comes to something like a Levirate marriage. To take care of one's family. To take care of members of one's tribe. To take care of a fellow Israelite. And the charge is that he is not named in the book of Ruth because, even though he's a good man, he lost his opportunity to have his name recorded in Ruth because of what he did. Now, what did he do? Boaz said, okay, Naomi's back. She has land that needs to be redeemed. So he asked this relative, do you want to redeem her land? He said, sure, I'll redeem her land. I'm the closest relative. I'll redeem her land. But Boaz says, that means you must also marry the Moabite Ruth. At which point, Plony, Tov, says, nope, sorry, not going to do it. He's worried about his reputation. He's worried about his any children he would have with her, because it's kind of implied that he's going, well, she's a Moabite. Why would I marry a Moabite? We're forbidden from marrying anybody from the Moabite nation. So he decides that he's not going to do it. And this is really the general explanation as to why he's not actually named in the book of Ruth, even though in other books in the Tanakh we're told what his name is. So Boaz on that day says, okay, I've given him the chance. Well, he has not taken that chance. So Boaz says before the men, the minyan that he has around him, I will redeem the land, and I will take Ruth as my wife. So it's on that day that Ruth becomes engaged. They get married. They are showered with a lot of blessings, a lot of just happiness for the future. And they marry. They have a son named Oved. Oved is the father of Yishai, or Jesse, who is the father of David. So that's why we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot as an honor to David himself, who is Ruth's great-grandson. And thus ends the book of Ruth. So it kind of starts on a down note, ends on a happy note. Does anybody have any questions, any comments? At least we made it through without the storms coming through. Okay. Just wanted to remind everybody that it does cost money to have one shul up. We ask that anybody who comes to a class or a service, if you're able to go ahead and donate $5. It takes $100 a month to run one shul. So that's 20 people, $5. We have our 1 month. If you can't afford it, Patrick is always looking for people to volunteer. You can do classes, services. I'm sure he has other things that he needs done that he doesn't necessarily have time to do right now. If you want to contact me with any questions or comments or anything, you can reach me at Rochelester, pathoftorah.com, or you can just go to pathoftorah.com, which is my site. On the right hand side there's a contact form. You can do that too. You can also, if you look above the video here, there you can click on that and email Patrick as well. So I want to thank everybody for coming out. If you have any questions or anything, contact me, contact Patrick. Anybody have anything they want to add or say before we leave for the night? Yep, you are absolutely right, Paul. This does show a way that we are to treat people on the lower end of the scale. Women, foreigners, sojourners, widows, the poor. I mean, you can see from the beginning that Elimelech ran away from his responsibilities, and he paid for it. But Boaz did what he was supposed to do. He was responsible, and he was given the gift of having David as his grandson and eventually the Mashiach as his descendant, as did Ruth for her faithfulness to Naomi and to Hashem. Anybody else have anything? Okay, just want to thank you all for coming out tonight. Again, you can contact me or contact Patrick if you have any questions or concerns or feedback, and trust me, I would love to have feedback about the class tonight. So I hope everybody has a great Shabbat and a great Shavuot. Thank you, Sarah. Good night, everybody.